The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. From the studios of WSFM-LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm Burst of Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can send us email with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just let us know so we can brag about it. You can find radio-friendly versions of the show of 59 minutes in length by visiting archive.org and searching for the collection The Final Straw. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat and underground and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week we feature two conversations. The first is with an anti-fascist in Charlotte, North Carolina, about the quote-unquote March Against Communism event that might be taking place in that city on Thursday, December 28th. Anticommunist Action, the Nazi group that originally announced the event, had hoped to hold it in Marshall Park but never applied for a permit. It got told off by the city and maybe canceled it. This anti-fascist, Soyboy, thinks it might still occur. Then we will air Williams' chat with two local anarchist medical professionals about a recent censorship by the Trump administration of language in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This appeared as a minisode in our podcast feed. The three chat about possible implications of the removal of the following terms from the CDC's budgeting proposal: fetus, transgender, science-based, evidence-based, diversity, vulnerable, and entitlement. If you're in town this New Year's Eve, there will be a gathering at the jail for a noise demo. It's suggested that you bring loud noise-making materials and warm clothes because it's going to be cold, and reach out to those on the other side of the bars.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a blood.
Let's talk about happiness. Some famous dead guy included the pursuit of happiness as one of our unalienable rights described in the U.S. Constitution, right up there with life and liberty. It would seem that at least to the famous dead guy, we live and have the freedom to choose our own way for the purpose of getting happy. We have lots of self-help gurus who write books giving us advice on how to get happy. Impossible to know how many of those gurus are truly happy themselves. Clearly, they wrote their books out of an unhappiness with their own financial situations before having written the books. The Dalai Lama wrote a book entitled The Art of Happiness. So, even the world's most iconic Buddhist figure proposes that there is a spiritual basis for getting happy. We've got lots of products that promise us happiness, and we're seemingly developed and produced with our personal happiness in mind. Food, for instance. It appears that lots of bacon makes us happy. It isn't enough to have bacon on the pizza. We need it stuffed into the crust also. And pills. We can turn on TV and see really miserable people get medicated in a commercial, and then run around wide-eyed in a kind of creepy Disney animated world that apparently makes them happy and is supposed to make us happy too. You always see happy people in beer commercials. None of the bars I ever attended looked quite that happy. I suppose that our commercial culture, where we have a paradigm of the sciences called consumer psychology, partly explains our sometimes ineffective approach to happiness. We are somewhat brainwashed into thinking that if we are not happy, if we aren't shiny happy like the folks in the beer and pharmaceutical commercials, then our happiness can be obtained if we go out and get something we're missing. What I mean is, the pursuit of happiness really becomes a pursuit of happiness. We go seeking our happiness, and we chase it. We look for what we're missing. Maybe it's a piece of furniture or a car we think will make us happy, or perhaps someone to love us. We run after things outside of ourselves, like a small child chasing butterflies. That's an approach that works well for those who sell us bacon and beer and pills. I don't know that it works well for us. It seems to me that happiness has to come from inside of us. Happiness, I think, is a sense of satisfaction and contentment, a general feeling that your situation is good. To me, that means you have to be living a life that has meaning and purpose, a life that gives you the sense that what you do and who you are matters. I remember in grade school teachers asking us stupid kids what we wanted to be when we grew up. I remember the responses. Some kids wanted to be police officers or firefighters or soldiers because those occupations would give them a sense of meaning and purpose. Some wanted to be doctors or lawyers. When the teacher called on me and asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said, I want to be a man. It seemed to me then that if I was to grow up, I would want to be an adult human, and that's what I wanted to be, apart from whatever it is I might do. So from this answer, we can extrapolate that at the age of 6, I was either unusually wise or I was something of a moron. Let's go with wise. In order for us to engage the world in a way that makes us happy, that gives us purpose and meaning, we have to first arrive at a place where we value what we are. Only by arriving as someone who values what we are can we then engage the world in a way that gives us purpose and meaning. So in this darkest and most miserable time of the year, I urge you to drudge up a great deal of really depressing stuff by engaging in a year-end retrospection. But the most important question to ask yourself if you want to be happy and if you want to live a life of meaning and purpose is this: do you value yourself? I think that's an important place to start the pursuit of happiness, because if you don't value yourself, you can never get happy. You're not happy with yourself. And being unhappy with yourself is probably a pretty common thing, seeing how we're trained to be unhappy with ourselves. Unhappy people are much better consumers than happy ones. Go figure. So there are forces at work to make us unhappy with ourselves, to make us value ourselves less. Let's stop listening to that messaging and start actively valuing ourselves so we can be reasonably happy with who we are and engage the world in a way that is meaningful and purposeful, a way that gives us a sense of that we matter. In a world like this, valuing yourself is a radical act, so let's do more of that. And since I haven't mentioned it yet in the whole 5 minutes I've been rambling, let's also tip over cop cars and burn them. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from War and Corruption in Lebanon, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at Sean Swain 243-205, Warren CI, P.O. Box 120, 5787 State Route 63, Lebanon, Ohio 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org.
We're speaking with an anti-fascist in Charlotte, North Carolina, about the likelihood of the, quote, March Against Communism, unquote, planned by the group Anticommunist Action in Marshall Park, Charlotte. Thanks a lot for chatting, and would you care to introduce yourself further?
Yeah, my name is Soy, and I'm with Charlotte Defense League.
So in October, Unicorn Riot reported that a group called ACA, or aka Anticom, aka Anticommunist Action, was planning to hold a torch rally in Charlotte, North Carolina on December 28th. Can you explain for listeners who, as far as is known, is ACA and where they come from and what their deal is?
It comes from a lot of the reactionary internet culture. You see a lot of the Pinochet imagery, which they later decided to take out before the rally to make their message more palatable for the working class. But make no mistake, these people are fascists, and they were glorifying the right in Charlottesville when it was happening, and it's very unsettling to see in our community.
But you mentioned Pinochet. Can you say like what the whole like subcultural reference to Pinochet was? Like he was a dictator in Chile after the coup.
There was a fascist dictator, and one of the things that he was famous for was torturing political dissidents and also throwing them out of helicopters. And a lot of these political dissidents were communists, or at least it was said that they were communists. So for the anti-communist scene, the image of the helicopter or throwing someone out of a helicopter is a symbol for violence against communists.
Yeah, and that's the reference that people are making when they say free helicopter rides or whatever, right?
For sure, yes. It's a very violent imagery, and it's something that I know I've seen on T-shirts on fascists at rallies.
So can you also break down the whole anti-communism stance in terms of like a reaction to Antifa, reminiscent of Rock Against Communism, and maybe if you know anything about why the yellow and black color scheme on their flags?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the yellow and black color scheme. The yellow and black is the color scheme for what they call anarcho-capitalism. Of course, that sounds contradictory because it is anarchy and capitalism. It's a right libertarian view that really values the free market and is extremely individualist. Somehow this political ideology has become a lot of synonymous with the reactionary meme culture. So by fascists using the ANCAP flag, it broadens their message to a lot more people which may be susceptible to reactionary propaganda, but who might not necessarily be violent fascists.
Okay, and what about the Rock Against Communism part of it?
Yeah, I think that's very similar because in an interview, Seth Vitko, one of the Charlotte organizers of AntiCom, had talked about how they used AntiCom as a shortening of anti-communist as a play on the phrase Antifa, which they would say in quotes is anti-fascist.
It seems like it's a lot easier for someone to make a stance that will be acceptable, like more acceptable, even along the right in the U.S., by eschewing the term fascist in favor of saying, well, I'm against totalitarian communism, and that's all that these Antifa are, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of messaging in the media that anti-fascists are anarchist or communist movement explicitly. And to say that they are anti-communist when people watching Fox News are being told that the communists are breaking the bank windows is something much more palatable than fascism, right? Anti-communism is very prevalent in our society, unfortunately. So it's very easy to play off, and they're very accepted viewpoints.
You mentioned Seth Vitko. What's known about this person?
Seth Vitko has shown up on the message boards as one of the head representatives in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's been seen at UNCC, but he's not a student. I don't know that much about him, honestly. I haven't read all the logs.
Looking at the article, Discord log shows neo-Nazi agenda behind Anticommunist Action. There's a picture of Seth looking like a little 16-year-old dressed up for Halloween with an AR-15 minus the clip. Looks kind of like something out of Stormship Troopers or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this here. This is some German Nazi bullshit, but he was going by Hamsturmführer. I guess, is that Hamsterführer?
Hauptsturmführer. My German audience is going to hate me for this. What does that mean?
Does that mean hamster? But Führer is, in reference to like Hitler, right? And Pepe would be the comic, which has been unfortunately mostly co-opted by the reactionary alt-right online. There's a part right here in the Unicorn Riot article where it says, quote, Anticom members were also keen to discuss Holocaust denial, as well as valorize attacks on Jews, Muslims, and people of color, with many references to lynchings and gas chambers. Anticom's Discord chats contained a substantial amount of hate speech. Server logs we received showed 1,107 messages containing the N-word, 445 uses of the word and 412 references to Hitler sent over a span of 7 months. The phrase Hitler did nothing wrong appears 21 times.
That's a lot of having to remind yourself, huh?
Yeah.
No, but really, guys. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, so that, or one of these same UR or Unicorn Riot articles included emails from city officials in Charlotte, including the mayor, stating that Anticom hadn't applied for permits and that they were wanting to deny the permits if they actually did apply, saying that they had no place in the city. The Twitter handle for Anticom stated that it was canceling the rally due to safety concerns. But so y'all are still planning a counter demonstration. Why?
Yeah. September 28th, Anticom said that they were no longer going to hold the rally in Marshall Park. I don't think that that means that they have canceled, although I haven't heard any chatter from them. And it is true that Richard Spencer pulled out because of security concerns. Richard Spencer would be happy to go to a protected conference and speak to some fascists indoors, or the pop-up rallies, which Richard Spencer has been trying to popularize. Pop-up rallies are much easier for them, as they won't have to face any opposition. They know that this indicates their lack of mass support.
Do you think there might be still a possibility that they'll try to maybe do one of these like flash mob things for photo ops or something?
I definitely think that that's a possibility. I think that we can't sit on our ass, and we have to be prepared to defend our community. And even if they don't show up, I think it's important that the community gets together to show fascists that they're not welcome in our city.
So since August 12th in Charlottesville, Virginia, the far right has seen dwindling numbers and street presence around the country. Many have speculated that the time for Nazis amassing in the streets and universities may have passed as the costs for them mount. The public has lost sympathy with their BS free speech arguments, and they're forced to lick their wounds. It should be noted that anti-fascist scholars seem mostly to agree that street presence is a major step in the institutionalization of fascism proper, historically, in many different scenarios, whether it be in Latin America or Europe. What do you think about that, and where does that leave anti-fascist organizers who are able and willing to take the streets when the fascists aren't?
Yeah. Regarding dwindling numbers of fascists on the streets, I'm not sure that I agree that's the case. Although they have been shut down numerous times in Shelbyville, Austin, and other cities, I think that the Anti-Communist March is a great example of the fascists trying to broaden their audience and to be more palatable to the general public. Recycling old anti-communism. Although the anti-communist messages may not be read as overt white supremacy, they are still consistent with the views held by white supremacists, and we cannot allow them to have any platform to say anything in public. I'd like to challenge the idea of the anti-fascist organizer. We all know that Antifa isn't a particular organization. It's people in the community that understand the implications of rising fascism and the need to keep their community safe. Fascists are not only anti-Semitic and racist, but also anti-woman, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant, and anti-working class. If you are concerned about your community, if you're concerned about your neighbors, you can't be quietly opposed to fascism in the privacy of your own home or work. We have to come out into the streets and directly oppose it. Convince your family and friends that simply knowing that Nazis are bad is not enough. It's a very low bar. We must come out into the streets and force fascists out of our communities.
Is the problem that you have with the idea of anti-fascist organizers that it's a professionalization of that, or? For
instance, a year ago, I didn't think that I would be where I am, having gone and faced fascists in all of these, at all these rallies, being interviewed by you here today. I was concerned, and I started taking action, and it's come full circle to the point where I have had an opportunity to organize in my city, but I think the idea of organizers separates the community from the action, and I think it's really important that we address this as a community together.
Okay, I see that point. So, in opposition to the massive street demonstrations that have at least been pushed over this last year, so last 2 years, by Nazis, by Klan, by racists of various sorts, white nationalists. Lone wolf strategies have also been a topic that's been brought up, and I think that Richard Spencer did some writing on it at one point. And a lot of those Discord logs also discuss the idea of people going out and doing stuff on their own, doing extreme acts, and thus hopefully not being able to be stopped as easily. In a way that, especially in the wake of Charlottesville and things in the Northwest and Portland, are reminiscent of the same Islamic State activities that the far right fears is taking over the world or whatever. But so do you see lone wolf strategies coming to the head more with groups like AntiCom, or what was that, the Atomwaffen Brigade or whatever they were called?
Yeah, I think what's concerning about Atomwaffen, which is extra concerning because, they were found with radioactive materials. But I think what's concerning about these groups, whether they are as capable as Atomwaffen or just have the intent that we've seen expressed in these Discord logs, the fact that they are in groups shows that these ideas are not held by singular people. With the internet now, you think that you're the only person that holds an idea, but then they find these other people and they egg each other on.
Yeah, but the more that I think the point of lone wolf is that, like, people can go and do that strategy, or they can see that having a flag, having a name, and such makes them more targetable. Like, the far right steals so much from nihilists and anarchists. I mean, there's like tons of like unaffiliated groups that do activities around the world that don't claim an identity, that don't put out manifestos necessarily or communiques, but in part because their activities are not meant to be, they're meant to be offensive, and they're not meant to be like clearly understandable by systems of power. And systems of power need to address something by name, by identity, by purpose in order to organize against those things. So the lone wolf call, like there are still going to be people doing mass organizing or trying to do mass organizing from a far right perspective, while lone wolves would take actions, like direct actions of their own, whether it be driving into a crowd in Charlottesville or trying to drive into an anti-Nazi rally in Portland or stabbing someone on the trains. And Atomwaffen is an example of this weird hybrid, it seems, where they had a public identity, they had motivations that they were publishing online in order to make themselves reproducible, but at the same time, if they had done any activities, it would have been traced back to them, right? So I guess the lone wolf would make them harder to track. The less people you have in the know of your planning, the less weak links.
I think that we'll be seeing both here. I think that their views are supported by other people like them, but there is going to be organized actions and there will be more terroristic attacks. That's why we have to consistently give no platform to fascists. One of our goals in Charlotte is we want to unite with the liberals as a community and show more effective ways to stand up for their community.
For anyone who's planning to show up to counter the Nazi demo in Charlotte, do you have any suggestions for safety from the police and from the fash?
Please cover your face. I know in communications I've been having with some of my more liberal friends, they seem to have this idea that they're not radical enough to cover their face, or they wouldn't do something illegal, so they don't need to cover their face. It's useful for everyone to cover your face. It protects you, and it protects your family and your community. The threat of doxing is very real. Doxing is when someone takes personal information and releases it or uses it in a malicious way against you. Masking up is one of the most important things you can do to combat doxing, and also it helps move with unity and it helps allow the group to do what they need to do to be effective.
So there is a law on the books in North Carolina dating back to 1953 against masks, basically, and not specifically in the enactment of a criminal activity. So, yeah, I guess would the idea be then if you're going to cover your face, do it thoughtfully with that in mind in terms of where police are and.
It is a misdemeanor to cover your face in North Carolina. Ironically, these laws were supposedly passed to dissuade public appearances of the Klan. Of course, we know this was merely a gesture by legislators who were likely wearing hoods themselves at the end of the day. Yes, we do acknowledge the risk, but we still think that it is the best course of action, especially if we all do it together. I think it's advantageous that we will be with this group of liberals. We absolutely want to stay with the group. Masking helps you operate in a group, and it's important that you stay in a group. It's imperative that everybody shows up on time. 4 p.m., December 28th at Marshall Park, 800 East 3rd Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. Showing up on time assures that we create a crowd for ourselves. Google how to make a face covering with a t-shirt or bandana, or wear balaclava. It will be cold. We'll be in the low 30s, and it'll start getting dark around 5 o'clock. So bring a flashlight, get good rest the night before, come well fed, well hydrated, and alert. Bring friends, and never leave your battle buddy. I recommend knee pads if you have them, and gloves.
So if someone hasn't been to an anti-racist or anti-fascist rally before, or is kind of new to this stuff and does want to get involved, do you have any suggestions or warnings about how to start doing stuff? If you come across a social media presence or a website that's asking for your information to get you involved in, make you a super soldier or whatever, do you have any clues?
An ad on Craigslist to be a paid protester for Soros. We've all been in that place. That was me not so long ago. I think things to keep in mind are when you see things online, be very cautious of what you interact with as far as Facebook pages, Facebook events. Some of these Facebook pages and websites are actually what's called a honeypot, where there is malicious intent to capture your information as they're identifying you as a leftist or whatever to put you on a dox list. I think that what's important is to go and get out to a rally. Bring your friends. You don't want to straggle behind. Stragglers get picked off by fashion pigs. Let's see. What else do you tell people that are protesting for the first time?
I think it's really important to trust your judgment also. And if you feel that you're not, if a scenario changes and you feel like you can't handle what's going on, it's cool to extricate yourself, to get yourself out of there. Just be aware of your surroundings, who's around you, and yeah, like you say, stick with your friends, make sure everyone's safe, take care of yourself for sure.
Absolutely. We keep us safe. And if there's ever a point where you feel uncomfortable, you should absolutely start identifying how you can get out of that situation as safely and quickly as possible. It's worse to be in a situation where you're panicking than to be scared. It's okay to be scared. Fear is a tool to identify threats. If you measure that threat is something that you don't want to face, you should leave the area. You don't have to get arrested. There's nothing that you have to do. Stay comfortable and stay safe.
Fear is the mind killer.
Yeah.
I've heard it voiced a bunch of times by different folks about how showing up whenever there's a danger that the fascists might show up, even if we're not sure, is a way for them to sort of run out our energy, and that could lead to burnout. Do you have any suggestions for avoiding burnout for folks that are looking to oppose the rise of fascism?
Let's see. What are actual tips?
I mean, boundaries are good, right? It's good to like do some thinking, figure out your boundaries. How much energy do you have to put into things? Sort of set a schedule or like a goal for yourself. Maybe look at your level of activity and ask yourself like, what do I need to keep myself energized enough to keep coming back? And how do I do self-care?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is taking care of yourself before an event and making sure that you're well hydrated and well fed. But I think it's important to understand that this work absolutely can be traumatizing, and it's okay to talk about that.
Yeah, it's important too. It's necessary. And it's possible for those of us that that are lucky enough to have good communities and good comrades. So if the racists don't show up, are there any events like concerts or meals or any other events that are going to be going on that aren't just opposing the racists?
I've heard that the liberals might have hot cocoa when we get back from the march.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting.
Maybe, I don't know, do you think it's important to talk about Charlotte and the place that Charlotte plays in terms of like demographics? It's been important as like one of the larger centers of African American like middle class in the country.
I think it's interesting. I think planning an event at Charlotte is indeed ballsy, because like if there's any place where the masses are going to kick your ass, like we're going to come out and kick your ass.
I mean, why do you think there would be such popular opposition specifically in Charlotte?
I think that there was a fairly recent precedent for mass uprising in the Charlotte uprising, but that's true, right? Like there's a precedent for mass uprising.
It's a total statement of fact that a little over a year ago, in response to the police murder of an unarmed African American man in Charlotte, there were weeks of in the street activity and mobilization by communities of color and their allies.
Yeah. I think that the fascists keep getting pushed out of where they have their marches.
I mean, that's a thing, right? I mean, that's like I had a chat with someone recently about cryptocurrencies, about a series of articles that came out talking about how there was an increase in use among the far right. A lot of people who got doxxed and lost their family connections and their jobs and everything after public participation in Charlottesville. You get pushed out of one place. It's not that you're going away, it's that you get pushed into another.
Yeah, it seems like they keep getting pushed to other places. And I think it's interesting to be at a place where it's like you could be pushed to were they pushed to Charlotte? That would be ironic because it seems like Charlotte has a lot of potential for resistance.
Yeah, or maybe it's more likely that just Seth Vitko is from there and he wants something to happen in his backyard so he can get, whitey points or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I think I was giving him too much credit there. I highly doubt that the majority of those planners have been to actions before. And, the alt-right loves to make critiques of leftists LARPing, but, you look over these Discord chats and, I mean, they're literally LARPing as Pinochet, so.
Yeah, or characters from 300 or Pepe. Thanks a lot for chatting.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Today I talked with two anarchist healthcare workers about the Trump administration's censorship of language regarding the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's 2018 budget proposal documents. We talk about what this means, some recent context for similar censorship, how CDC budget documents affect people's everyday lives, and recommendations for how to move forward. Unfortunately, the taping of another show made it into the background noise of this minisode. Sorry about that. If you listen closely, though, you might learn something about the latest game. To read more about this recent censorship, you can get online and type something along the lines of CDC list of banned words into your browser for some more background context. These questions. So, hello. Would you introduce yourselves in whatever way makes sense and speak about how you'd like to be referred to?
Sure. Thanks for having us on the show. I'm a local anarchist physician assistant.
Hey, and I am a local anarchist registered nurse. And yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's a pleasure, y'all. So we're here to talk about this recent curtailing of language at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. People may have heard about this via their news feeds or Twitter feeds or whatnot, but can you talk about what happened in your understanding?
Sure. My understanding thus far, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of information out about this yet, but it seems that the CDC, some top CDC officials received a briefing that apparently came from somebody within the Trump administration with a list of words that were not allowed to be included in the CDC budget for next year.
And that's just for budgetary documents, right? Is it?
That's my understanding. At this point, it's just for budgetary documents.
And what are those words for anyone who hasn't heard?
The words that are apparently disallowed or not encouraged in the CDC budget are vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based.
To your knowledge, has anything like this ever happened before? Has government tried to curtail language as far as healthcare goes in the U.S. before or ever, as far as you know?
As far as I'm aware, nothing like this has ever happened before, and I find it particularly interesting that they're including evidence-based and science-based because, in fact, not only has this not happened before, but those particular words are really considered the foundation of all intelligent healthcare and are used so broadly. I can't even imagine what it could lead to if we're not including them in our budgetary documents.
I haven't heard that this has happened before specifically, but I also haven't looked into that. I did make a list of things that have happened since January that have to do with science and languaging from the government. So in January, the EPA was given a gag order, y'all might remember, which basically said that folks who work at the EPA can't post things on social media and are not allowed to talk to journalists. And shortly after that, their website was scrubbed of a bunch of language relating to climate change and that sort of thing. And then in March, the Department of Energy banned its staff from using the terms climate change or Paris Agreement in any of their communications. And then their websites were also scrubbed of similar languaging. And the U.S. Geologic Survey had climate change language removed from their reports on... They had confirmed that sea level rising was an effect of climate change, and they had to remove that language from their documents. And then in June, of course, Trump left the Paris Agreement. So it seems like this is part of an ongoing trend in the Trump administration to curtail science that they disagree with, essentially.
I mean, it seems extremely troubling. It seems, like, dare I say, like a marker of fascism. Like, would that be going too far?
I would consider it a ominous sign for the future of access to health care, particularly because some of the words seem to really target marginalized people and women's health care. But even more ominous to me, and I am somebody who identifies as queer and transgender, so those things are of deep concern to me, but I'm particularly concerned that we seem to be wanting to take out anything pertaining to scientific research. That seems very ominous, and I'm very concerned about what they want to replace that with. I have some terrible thoughts about what that could be, but we'll just have to wait and see how that goes.
I agree with my colleague. It's certainly extremely alarming. I'm not sure how we're supposed to do science without being science-based. I don't know how I would practice medicine without being evidence-based, science-based. Everything that I am supposed to do on a daily basis as a provider is I'm supposed to provide evidence-based medicine in the course of my day as a medical provider, and I'm oath-bound and duty-bound and ethics-bound to do that. And having Trump administration say that, we can't have documents that say evidence-based in them from the CDC, which, is a leading institution of health in this country, is extremely alarming.
I was curious about the list of words. As a non-medical person, it seems pretty clear to me why a hostile to marginalized people's government might ban words like, might curtail the language around transgender folks and around fetuses, though I could also see, like, people do a lot of sorts of different research on fetuses that, like, isn't, like, abortion-based or whatever. But I was more curious about the words like entitlement and vulnerable. Could you talk about what do curtailing those words mean to you? Before we started recording, you mentioned, like, Medicare.
Yeah, I think, when I think of entitlement to services and entitlement to Medicare, entitlement to Medicaid, and there are probably other applications of that I'm unaware of. With vulnerable, I think about, I work in a clinic that's supposed to specifically serve vulnerable populations, of which there are many in this country, including, undocumented people, transgender people, poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, the list goes on. And these populations are particularly vulnerable to poor health outcomes. And to not be able to study those poor health outcomes of those populations could have significant impacts on my ability to provide quality care to members of those populations.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And I think it's interesting they're not adding all of those groups to a list of forbidden words, but the specific adjective vulnerable as applies to those groups, which I think that adjective tends to help people get more access to services, or in a budget document, which is what we're specifically referring to, could justify more funding for those groups if we're referring to them as vulnerable. Whereas if we take out the word vulnerable, that concerns me, because then it's just a group like any other group potentially in the budget document, and that's actually false. Those groups aren't groups like any other group, and they do need more funding, and it looks like we're trying to restrict that.
You mentioned a little bit before about, like, how this could materially affect populations. Like, could you go into that a little bit more? How we could start seeing impacts on the ground in healthcare in 2019?
I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that. I think it's speculative. I know the CDC stands to lose approximately $1 billion with billion with a B in this budget go round, and that's certainly concerning. The CDC does a lot of different things. I don't work there, and I'm not familiar with the scope of everything that they do, but they, in my practice, I use their guidelines quite frequently. They put out guidelines pertaining to how to treat certain diseases, how to track certain diseases. I know that they are involved in tracking the spread of different communicable diseases around the country, and that certainly has an impact on my day-to-day practice, taking care of my patients.
I think my concern, we've certainly been seeing restriction of funding for women's healthcare, transgender healthcare for poor children. The CHIP program just lost its funding. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so what this seems to be specifically focusing on is not so much programs, but research that can benefit all of us, really. But they seem to be really focusing on my concern is they might be trying to limit research that can benefit marginalized people, women, children, any vulnerable marginalized population. So that combination of words, evidence-based, science-based, transgender, fetus, it just really looks like we're trying to crack down on certain types of research so that we're not making any progress in the CDC's recommendations for those particular groups of people. Yeah. And so that is what concerns me moving into the future.
Something to consider that may not be obvious is the connection between research and medical practice. I don't know if people are really familiar with that, but for example, in terms of transgender patients, there's some debate in older transgender women of their risk for clotting. So blood clotting the risk of blood clotting is increased by the use of estrogen, and the risk of blood clotting increases as we age. And blood clotting is a good thing when you cut yourself, but it's a bad thing when it causes a stroke or a heart attack. And it's unclear because we don't have studies, we don't have evidence-based studies on large cohorts in this small example of older transgender women. I don't know if I should be putting them on anticoagulants. I don't know when I should take them off their estrogen, or if I should take them off estrogen, or, what the consequences of either of those decisions are going to be. And I have to make life or death decisions with my patients now. And I daily make these life or death decisions with my patients. And without evidence, we're all guessing. And that can lead to fatalities. It can lead to morbidity. It can lead to injury. It can lead to death. So the connection between research and health outcomes is immediate and sometimes devastating. And I don't think that can be emphasized enough.
I was unaware of that. Thanks for going into that. Are there ways that you would recommend that people, or ways that you are yourself interfacing with this information, and what would your recommendations be for people moving forward with the ongoing, like you pointed out, the ongoing sort of controlling of resources via language and resources via departments like the CDC?
I think as an anarchist, my inclination is to want to focus on alternate infrastructures. To me, this means that we could be looking at a future where we are relying less and less on the CDC, which is a terrible thing. The CDC does wonderful research that, as my colleague is saying, benefits us all. And
I think they're really sad about this. Everyone at the CDC seems super alarmed as well.
Yeah, that's what I was reading as well. And they seem to have some interest in fighting back on this, and so that is promising. But meanwhile, there are universities, health departments, a lot of other organizations that are able to do research and able to get funding for research that might not be government funding. And I think we may be looking at needing to rely more and more on those, and potentially even as research is coming out, because certainly the CDC will continue putting forth recommendations and doing research, and we may be moving into a situation where we have to read through their recommendations very carefully and question the legitimacy of the research that they're doing. And we may be needing to look more deeply at the need to investigate other, even university settings, looking into the politics of the university, the neutrality of the university, and starting to really do some research on the research, which we already do anyway as healthcare providers. There's certainly, pharmaceutical companies fund a lot of research. So we're already looking at that before we read research. We check to see who funded that research and whether or not there were massive conflicts of interest in that research. That's actually really common trouble in research. So we're just going to need to start being much, much, much more careful. The CDC is an organization we've been able to trust, and perhaps in the future that won't be a valid research institution. We'll just have to see how that goes. But there will still be research, and there will still be other forms of infrastructure that we can rely on, and we can keep focusing on those and creating more and more forms of alternate infrastructure that don't rely on the state, that don't rely on state funding, aren't affected by state control, because clearly all of those organizations are increasingly compromised right now.
Yeah, as an anarchist, I think I have a lot more questions than answers when it comes to, the question of where are we going to get reliable research in the future, or are we going to get any research in the future on certain topics, that include these quote-unquote banned words, for example. But, trying to imagine what is possible, there's that, I can't remember that guy's name, that professor that's making medications, on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. You know who I'm talking about?
I know you're talking about. I don't remember his name. That guy.
Dr.
YouTube.
Yeah, there's this professor, I think, of English literature or something. I could be totally wrong.
Incredible.
There's a professor who's doing some interesting work in creating life-saving medications with small home lab equipment, things you can buy from the store, mason jars, things like that. I'm not saying that's a viable way to make safe medications and take them, because it's almost certainly not. But it's interesting to prove the point that it's possible that these medications don't have to be this expensive. They can be made cheaply. I think it's a good talking point, if you will. And I wonder if something similar could be done for research, if there's some way that clever anarchists or other folks could come up with a proof of concept, essentially, of not that they're going to go out and do large cohort studies immediately, but maybe there could be some imagining of how that could look, of how we could imagine doing our own research or coming up with some kind of standards that are viable to use in a medical setting through a different kind of organization than a governmental organization, or from a different kind of organization than a university setting, although I think those are good alternatives in the short term.
There was a great article in the last couple of days I think it was in It's Going Down, about using universities in a more, I guess, offensive approach as anarchists to really creating revolution, which kind of just sparked my brain more thinking about alternative university settings where we can create our own radical so-called universities, but whatever else we might want to call them, free schools, but organized centers of learning that are founded on anarchist principles that then would have potentially the human power and possibly over time the lab resources and whatever else we might need to actually start doing some of our own research. So that was kind of sparking my thinking today, that particular article.
That's
got
really
me excited.
Cool. That's really, really cool. I didn't realize that the university had so much potential in it. Obviously it's a hotbed of resources. Obviously it's also used by anarchists, from sneaking into the film room to have a private screening to to getting money for your touring anarchist or whatever authors to come get a paid gig or whatever. But I didn't realize it had medical potentialities there too.
Universities are doing science. The leading transgender healthcare guidelines come out of UCSF currently, which is a university, for example. So the guidelines I use in the care of my transgender patients actually don't come from the CDC. They come from a university.
Yeah, likewise, I use those same guidelines at work.
I almost want to ask y'all, how worried do you think people should be? And obviously, this is worrisome, and maybe that's an unhelpful question, or an unhelpful framework. But how concerned do you think that people should be about this?
I think people should be very concerned about this. It seems like early stage fascism, as you were saying earlier, early stage censorship in a way that could be a harbinger of something worse. And I think if people silently acquiesce to this and just say, okay, we'll just, instead of saying transgender, we'll say persons who identify with another gender other than their birth or something. Acronyms could be come up with so that word searching software does not find it in your budget requests or whatever. I think acquiescing to those things is a very bad thing. I think a strong response early and a strong no early to these things is very important.
And would a strong no be down to the CDC?
I'm not 100% certain that the CDC is empowered to just say no, because they do rely on government funding. And so I think that makes it a very complicated issue. I think because I'm an anarchist, my mind tends to go to alternate infrastructures. I think other people's minds probably go to calling their senators and things like that. And I think those are things that people should do if that's what they feel excited about doing. I personally don't feel a lot of hope in that direction at the moment, the way the Trump administration is going. It just, I do feel very concerned that this is a trend and that we're going to continue to see more and more of this type of thing. And it appears to me to be a type of, possibly foreboding a type of Christian fascism that could really have some devastating effects on healthcare in America for anybody except rich white people.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about replacing words, I looked at this article online. The government recommends that the CDC replaced science-based or evidence-based with the phrase CDC bases its recommendations on science in consideration with community standards and wishes, which is bizarre to me. That phrase means nothing. No, in my opinion, it means nothing to me.
It looks like it is saying if the particular community doesn't wish for that science recommendation, then we don't have to actually recommend that. That science doesn't need to exist if your particular community doesn't like it.
And this crazy community is wanting this weird thing, so whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, that's just totally bizarre. I mean, science in consideration of community standards and wishes is, Copernicus going to jail and Galileo going to jail. There's a long history of that. I mean, that certainly has happened for a long time. And, I think we've gotten to the place where we think of science as this really staid, boring, falling in line kind of thing. But it hasn't always been that way. Science has often flown in the face of community standards and wishes throughout time. And I think it's time for science and scientists and healthcare workers to take their place in that stream of history as people who are resistant to community standards and wishes when they go against the health of our patients and the well-being of our patients. And I think first and foremost, as healthcare providers, we're tasked with defending and upholding the best possible health outcomes for our patients. And that means fighting against this administration. That means fighting against, curtailing research. Mm-hmm. I don't think we can stop at the borders of the exam room. I think we need to realize that health outcomes are dependent on so many things, and it's our duty to work on all of those things.
I don't have any other questions for y'all. Is there anything else that you wanted to add as part of this little mini podcast?
I think I would encourage anybody concerned about this to focus intensive efforts on community healthcare organizing. And I feel like, in my personal opinion, that is the best direction to go, because I can't see that a phone call campaign to the CDC is really going to affect this. But I can see that anarchists create amazing things and do amazing things with mutual aid, and we have incredible opportunities if we pool all of our resources and all of our knowledge and come together and create the healthcare infrastructures that we need, that might not ever be like the extraordinary healthcare infrastructure that exists in America, but can definitely meet a lot of people's needs over time, mm-hmm. and will certainly be better than a healthcare infrastructure in America that doesn't serve the needs of probably most of America. So we're going to have to really start looking at doing that for ourselves. And I think that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in my, I guess, knowledge base, also as a non-professional, marginalized communities have been looking out for each other and, looking out for their own healthcare for a really, really long time. This form of oppression doesn't seem like it. I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book, right? It's like limiting people's resources, limiting people's access to this kind of thing, which is terrible. But it's also something that people have been dealing with for a really long time. But in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed.
Mm-hmm. This, the community standards and wishes substitution, mm-hmm. it reminded me of I forget what it's called, but there's like sex education overseas that mm-hmm. the U.S. sort of does, kind of. And they had to replace sex education with sex risk aversion.
Whoa.
Or something,
yeah.
Which the changing of the phrase sounds innocuous, but what it ended up meaning was that people could only be taught abstinence, which has been shown, evidence-based mm-hmm. and science-based, has been shown to not change people's sexual behavior in the least. So I think it's, these words mean something.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming into the studio at such short notice and talking about this at, it's been very thought-provoking for me. And, thanks for the work that you do and for your time and your energy.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And that was our interview with two anarchist healthcare workers about the list of 7 banned words for CDC 2018 budget documents. Thanks so much for listening, and good night.